Hi, I hope that this was finding you all keeping well, managing all the things that you're managing, all your coursework, all your assignments, and likely you've waited to watch this video until you're done your assignments for our class, and I'm looking really forward to reading those. So this afternoon, it is the first day of spring, Saturday afternoon. It's a little rainy outside, so I'm in the basement on the unceded and surrendered territories of Tecumseh, where I live, work, and play as an uninvited guest with gratitude and acknowledgement. And in a few weeks' time, we'll close off the course talking about colonialism as a project. We've talked about culture all term long. Colonialism as a project of cultural domination, and settler colonialism as a particular articulation of colonialism that is premised on the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from land, so that a new thing can emerge, a new structure called, in our case, Canada. And so when I have every week come to you acknowledging these unsurrendered, unceded territories, and you might not know what that means, in a couple weeks we will talk about exactly what that means. But for today, we're going to talk about social inequality and the concepts of race and ethnicity, and how we assign meaning to certain things and then arrange them in unequal ways to create unequal systems, unequal access to power, privilege, prestige, resources, all of the ways that social inequality works as a cultural system. Last time we talked about gender and sexuality, how we assign meaning, make meaningful, tell meaningful cultural stories about bodies and about roles in society, how we arrange that in particular kinds of ways. And now we're going to think about that more broadly, about how we assign meaning and arrange societies in particular kinds of ways. So that's what we're up to now. We'll talk about that. This week we'll talk about social inequality. Next week we'll talk about religion and cosmology. And then we'll close off the term talking about colonialism, cultural domination, colonialism, globalization, cultural change, all of those things. So we'll start. I've got the notes are posted for you, so I don't know if you follow along, but there they are. And just a reminder, if you're watching this in advance of the 26th, that's when your assignments are due. If you have any questions at all as you're working through them this week, do please let me know. But office hours, I've adjusted the time of my office hours a little bit this week to just accommodate some other things. So instead of 12 to 1 on Thursday, my office hours are 11:30 to 12:30. So just let me know if you want to book a time to chat this week, or email, of course, always works, or usually works. It doesn't, lately it hasn't always worked, but it usually works, or the Moodle messages work. So as we move into this last section of the class, talking about what social inequalities are and what we do with them. How do we actually think about them in a meaningful way, particularly if what we would like to see is change to those inequalities. So if we think about social organization, we talked about kinship and marriage as being ways that we organize ourselves. We make particular sets of relationships mean something, and we organize ourselves accordingly. We draw descent, we trace lineages, we organize settlement patterns, we do all kinds of things to organize ourselves socially so that we can survive over time. We do all kinds of things to organize ourselves politically with the distribution of power so we can organize ourselves and stay stable over time. So if social organization is culturally constructed, so that every week we talk about how we use culture to create meaning and assign values and particular kinds of things, and then organize them in ways that then allow us to collectively survive over time. So when we talk about what things are culturally constructed, everything that we've talked about this term, how we use culture to make meaning, that's how things are culturally constructed. So if social organization is culturally constructed, that means social inequality is also culturally constructed. Now, one of the beautiful things about culture is that it's always changing, right? We have that list that we go through all the time. It's shared, it's symbolic, it's learned, and it's always changing. And so if this is where hope sits, because when we look at social stratification, which is inequality, there's different ranks of people. Societies get organized in ways where there's different classes or different ranks or different accesses and all kinds of ways that we do that. If that's culturally constructed and culture is always changing, that means that can change. And that's where hope sits. So we'll sort of start with that and end with that today in the lecture. So what we're asking is, how does culture assign meaning to certain things and then arrange them in a way to produce social inequality? Social inequality it doesn't have to happen, right? It's specifically culturally produced. And there's a bunch of ways that we assign meaning and then differentiate access to create these tiered systems called social inequality or social stratification. So some of the main features, things like gender and sexuality, we talked about those ideas last time. We can assign particular meanings to and roles and responsibilities and allocate power in particular kinds of ways. Maybe one gender is favored over the other. We can do the same thing with sexuality. The color of skin or the shape of your nose or the texture of your hair, all of those things, physical characteristics, perceived physical characteristics coming to mean something, that's what race is. Ethnicity, which is cultural beinghood or cultural association. Class, social class, does create a structure or system of inequality. Caste, caste system, depending on which caste you're in, is a permanent structure of social inequality. Age, depending on how a society values or a cultural context values particular ages or stages in the life cycle. People can be discriminated against based on age, just like they can be discriminated against based on race or gender or sexuality. Ability, the ability of the body. So a culture will decide and determine what is an able body, and then as a baseline of normal, right, of what it considers normal. We talk about culture creates what's normal, and in so doing creates what's abnormal. And so assigning value to what is determined to be an able contributing body versus, and then putting it in opposition to what is for some way just something determined to be a disabled body, and religion, right? And there's other ways that we assign meaning, and then where access to things in society cuts through that in unequal ways. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, because we're starting with the premise or the idea that humans are diversely different, beautifully, diversely different. Difference on its own, it does not mean inequality. It doesn't have to mean inequality. Difference is just diversity. It means diverse ways of looking, ways of moving, ways of speaking, ways of communicating. That's diversity. It's when we assign meaning to those things and organize that in a hierarchical way, that's where social inequality that's where social inequality is created. So what those differences come to mean is what creates the social inequality, not the difference. Difference on its own is just diversity. And I really I've got a quote here from Nelson Mandela. He says, "Poverty is not an accident. Like slavery and apartheid, it is man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings." And I agree, and I would say that until we really pay attention, tune into and pay attention to the ways in which meaning is assigned to difference and then that difference organized, that meaning, or it creates these systems of social inequality until we actually notice them. We can't change them. And a lot of the time, we don't even notice the ways that we normalize certain things, certain bodies, certain ways of looking, certain ways of speaking, certain gods to pray to, the way we normalize those things in our cultural context, which then by extension others out variety and difference and creates a system of social inequality. So the first thing we need to do is tune into it. What is being culturally constructed here? What are the values and messages that are being inscribed onto people? And then how is that being used to justify these systems of inequality, these structures and systems of inequality? So what is inequality then? What is social inequality? Very simply defined, social inequality is unequal access to power, wealth, privilege, and prestige. So we live in a society or I certainly live in a society where there is unequal access. There is unequal access to power, wealth, privilege, and prestige. And so what does that mean? What are those things? All of them are culturally constructed. So wealth is the accumulation of, we can think about wealth in a very cross-cultural, open way, the accumulation of financial resources, material possession, wives and children, and the potential of future earnings. So whatever cultural context determines wealth. It is always culturally specific. So maybe wealth is marked by being able to support multiple wives and multiple children. That would be a marker of wealth, because you can't have multiple wives if you don't have the access to the resources to support everybody. For example, maybe in our case, in a capitalist context, where the mode of exchange ideologically determines what constitutes wealth, which is the accumulation of capital surplus. That's about money, right? We value, in capitalism, we put the value on money, and the dream is, the desire is to accumulate the most of it. Maybe it's access to land, or access to sort of, the more access you have to the capacity to gather resources or create a surplus. So wealth, what determines wealth is culturally specific. Unequal access to that is what creates social inequality. Now, power, so we're talking about wealth, power, prestige, and privilege. So power is the ability to control resources in one's own interest. Not everybody has equal access to the power to control things in your interest. And it is an exercise. Power is an exercise. It's not a thing. It's not an item. It's an exercise. It's the ability to control resources, to control situations, to control the narrative, to control how things are viewed and understood in ways that serve your interests. And what's interesting about power, when we really start thinking about it, is that we can be in positions of power over others without even knowing it. And we talked a lot about power a few weeks ago when we were talking about political organization, the distribution of power, the different ways that power can be distributed, and social control, right? And recognizing those moments where we're in a position of power, where what we're trying to do is exercise our will over others, so that others will do what we want, and that will serve us. Right? Or when someone else's will is being exercised over ours. And noticing when we are in a position of power and when we're not is key to understanding how social inequality might be operating. Because a lot of the times, especially when you have power, you don't realize you have it. And when you're exercising power over others, you don't even realize you're doing it necessarily. And that's because of the way that culture goes unnoticed so much of the time. So these structures, the way we assign meaning, build these structures of social stratification and social inequality, are normalized into our common sense sort of understandings of the social order, so that when we are privileged, when we're landing on the privileged side of this social inequality, we don't even realize that we have privilege, nor do we realize when we're exercising power over others. So we can start thinking about that, start thinking about those things. Now, prestige, like wealth, is always culturally defined and specific. But what we can think of as prestige, so what constitutes that prestige, or what will give you prestige, is culturally specific. But you can think about prestige as a social honor. So this is the social esteem that others hold for you. So we're thinking about social inequality as unequal access to wealth, power, prestige. So not everybody has the same access to whatever is determined to be wealth. Not everybody has the same access to power, the ability to influence things in your direction, and not everybody has equal access to prestige or social honor, which would be the collective sort of the ways that others see you in a respected way. And not everybody has equal, in an unequal in social inequality, not everybody has access to privilege. Now, privilege is tricky to think about, especially when you have it. You notice privilege when you don't have it. You very seldom notice privilege when you do. So we're going to sort of spend a little time unpacking what privilege means. Privilege is you can think about privilege as the institutional and cultural preferential treatment of some groups over others. So you can see how when the system is designed as rigged in your favor, you probably don't even notice that it's rigged in your favor. It just is. It's just the system. You move through the world with all the doors held open, and you don't even realize it until one of those doors is closed and you have to open it yourself. And that is the moment where you're like, oh, I'm not used to that. I'm not used to not being favored. And I didn't even realize that I was being favored because of the color of my skin, or the language that I speak, or the way my body moves, or any, the ways that we are privileged, we don't even recognize until we're confronted with a moment where maybe we're not granted entirely granted that privilege. So those who don't have privilege notice it all the time. Those doors are always closed. Those of us with privilege can move through the world quite easily. I turn on the TV and it's people who look like me and speak the same language as I do, share the same cultural ideas and values as I do. I understand the jokes. I understand the stories. That is privilege, right? It's a privilege to see yourself reflected back in the dominant representations of cultural ideals and stories and versions. It's when you turn on the TV and you don't see any stories about people who look like you, or whose families look like yours, or whose body moves like yours, or who pray to the same God as you, and if there are moments where those things present, it is presented as an other category. That's when you're not privileged. That's when you recognize and feel that the absence of privilege. So social inequalities, these are the ways we assign meaning, create inequalities, get then built into cultural institutions to the point where they go completely unnoticed, specifically by the privileged. When you're privileged by the system is rigged in your favor, and you don't even realize that it's rigged in your favor because it's normal. It's just how it is. And so I have a couple of quotes here about privilege that I really like. So privilege, at its core, is the advantages that people benefit based solely on their social status. It is a status that is conferred by society to certain groups, not seized by individuals, which is why it can be difficult sometimes to notice one's own privilege. So I move through the world with white privilege. I have light skin. I move through a world that favors whiteness. that has normalized whiteness. Anything other than white is a racialized body, which speaks to the white privilege, the privileging of whiteness. And so I don't even think twice about race. I don't have to think about race. I don't have to think about the color of my skin or what the perception of that is going to be when I walk into a store, when I encounter a police officer, when I go through customs at the airport. I never have to think about it. I don't have to worry about the color of my skin being something that I need to overcome in the moment of encounter with authorities or with other people in the world. That is my privilege. That I did not earn that. That was given to me because I was born into a social system and structure that already privileged my white skin. So that's what the quote means. It is not something that you seize. You can't go out and seize white privilege. You have it or you don't. And that is not, it's not based on anything you did. Right? It's not based on any personal accomplishment of mine that when I have an encounter with a police officer, they see my white skin and treat me as a white-skinned person. And so there, any unconscious or overt biases that they might have don't present as interfering in my interaction with them. The same way that when I go into the liquor store, I can just buy whatever I want without fear of being judged, without fear of not being served. And that is based entirely on my white privilege. Not because it doesn't interfere. That privilege isn't interfered with by a racist stereotype, by an assumption that will get made about me or my family. And so that's an example of white privilege. That's the privileges that I move through the world with based on the color of my skin. I did nothing to earn the color of my skin. I was born. That's it. There's also heterosexual privilege. We have heteronormalized. We talked about sexuality last time. This when we talked about gender and sexuality. So the normalization, the sort of default normal notion of sexuality and sexual orientation is hetero. So love stories on TV are hetero. Everything seems hetero. If it isn't hetero, it's deemed. So there's marriage and then there's gay marriage, or there's sex and then there's same-sex sex. So it's othered out, and that's how we know what is privileged and what isn't. So when you move through, as a heterosexual woman, I didn't have to come out to my family. I didn't have to wrestle through any conflicts about who I was in relation to what messages and what society wanted me to be. I've always been able to legally have a union recognized by the state. So I have white privilege and I have hetero privilege. I move through the world in a way that doesn't make me have to explain myself. I don't have to justify why I have the right to be anywhere based on the color of my skin or my sexual orientation. What I don't have is male privilege. And this one is, as a gendered female, I encounter male privilege often. And it is interesting when we start thinking about the ways that we assign meaning to gendered, we create these gendered categories. And then we move through the world as gendered beings. And we are treated differently in different contexts. So for one example, I'm a university professor. As you know, you're watching this because I'm a university professor. Well, the whole structure of the academy really was premised on the idea that it was males, that academics were men, and if they had families, they had wives at home dealing with them, dealing with the families, right? Dealing with children and all the sort of inconvenient realities of family life. And home and housekeeping. And so when the aspects of professional expectations, the length or intensity of a work day. All of it is premised on the idea that you can't that you wouldn't be interfered with by having children or by having a family. And early in my career, I was even told, like, it will compromise your career. Having children will compromise your career as a woman. I am betting that none of my male colleagues, also who have children, were told the same thing. It doesn't compromise. It actually makes you a more valuable employee as a male. To have children, because then it means, and if to wife and children, because then it means you need that job. You're going to be a stable long-term employee. If you're a woman in the workforce, there will be an assumption likely made that your children are a liability. They will be the reason why you have to sometimes cancel class because you've got a sick kid, or that you got to go to the dentist, or you've got to go do something else, or you got to pick them up at school. All those inconvenient realities that will according to the narrative of what makes you a good productive worker, will be interfered with. Your value will be less. That's why women don't make as much money as men. It's why women have to really seriously work hard to overcome and justify interruptions, what are called interruptions in our careers. So that's one example of how male privilege figures in my life. And then it's little, it can be subtle. It can be the way that women can be talked over in a meeting. Or the idea of mansplaining, which is sort of it gets joked aside, but it's a real thing when you're in the context of, in a room full of academics. For me, for example, I'm in a room full of academics, and my opinion doesn't always get heard. I have to really hold space for myself to be heard at times. And nobody even realizes that they're doing it. Nobody even realizes that they just talked over me or never called on me, or in the context of the normalization and of privileging male voices. So while I have white privilege and heterosexual privilege, I don't have male privilege. And then there's class privilege. I definitely have class privilege, right? I make a good living. I can, and there is some prestige and sort of status that comes with my job. And so people like it, where I may lack male privilege, I do have class privilege. I didn't grow up in poverty. I didn't have to overcome poverty. My parents both went to university. It was a normal, expected thing that I would also go to university. I haven't moved up in social class against the odds. I have stayed very much in the social class that I was born into, which is a very privileged place to be. And it means I can afford the sort of privileges, class privileges to my son. He can have opportunities that come with that. So class privilege is certainly a very poignant reality. Poverty is one of the hardest things to overcome. You can have white privilege and be poor, and poverty is very, very difficult to overcome. So when we're talking about privileges, these are non-linear. These are not linear, and they can be very, very much intersecting. I have ability privilege. My body moves in a way that society accommodates. And there's some beautiful work done in the area of critical disability studies that talks about how it is not body's limitations or exceptionalities that is disabling, but rather the ways that we are built environments disable people. So somebody, for example, who uses a wheelchair for mobility isn't disabled by the wheelchair, is disabled by the buildings that are inaccessible to that wheelchair. Or, some of our classrooms at TRU are terrible. I've had to request class moves, so that we can make space for students who move differently, right? Who don't walk, but rather use a chair to get around. And not all of our classrooms at TRU are even like they don't accommodate that in an organic way. The same way that we gender bathrooms, we able or disable with our spaces, our built environments. our transportation networks, our reliance on voice, all kind. And so then we have to make accommodations, right? So we make accommodations for those who are different, whose bodies work differently, and in so doing, what we create is inequality. The difference itself isn't the problem; it's what we do with that and create the inequality. Now, cissexual privilege. This is where when your body, your physical body that is sexed, so when you're born and you're announced based on the way your body looks, male or female, when your gendered self aligns with your sexed self, the way that society says, okay, that's what that body means, and we gender it this way. When those two things line up, that we call that cissexual privilege, where you never have to question any confusion or any mismatch between what society, what your centered sense of self and gendered selfhood says you are, and what society has said you are. Where you never have to question which bathroom to go in, and you feel safe in that. Where I can go into a bathroom that is gendered female as a female identifying body, and I feel safe and I belong there. That's a privilege. And settler colonial privilege. And so this is for those of us who benefit from the structures of settler colonial dispossession in ways that we don't even question. It's just normal. That we can move through our lives in our case, in the case of Kamloops, unceded, unsurrendered territories, and never really even have to know why or acknowledge it. Where the structure, so Canada exists as this settler colonial structure, and it's our normal baseline, and we never have to think about or consider what needed to happen, what violence and dispossession needed to happen in order for that to exist at all. We just live in the thing that exists, right? That's settler colonial privilege, and we'll talk about that more in a couple weeks when we're talking about settler colonialism and colonialism. So you can think about privilege as about how society accommodates you. It's about advantages you have that you think are normal. It's about you being normal and others being the deviation from normal. It's about fate dealing from the bottom of the deck on your behalf. And you don't even know it's happening. So you don't even realize it's happening as you walk around campus and go to class and come out of class, that campus is built for those who can walk, right? You don't even have to think about that. But you are privileged because of the privilege. Those who can walk on their legs, those whose mobility is available to them by way of a wheelchair, campus is not built for you. They can accommodate you. They have retrofitted and tried to accommodate you, but that deviates from the normal. And it's not your body that is disabling. It's the way that we have assigned meaning to and normalize particular ways of moving and privilege those at the expense of others. So that's what privilege is. And I like this list when you think about, so what does it mean to be privileged? And I am going to ask you on your final assignments to think about privilege. Think about how you are privileged, where you are privileged, and how you're not. And what that lives like, what that means, and then what we do about that. So what it means to be privileged. It means that you can assume that most of the people you or your children study in history classes or textbooks will be of the same race, gender, or sexual orientation as you. So you go to school, you learn the history of your people. It makes sense. It's your people. It resonates. You can connect to it. Assume that your failures will not be attributed to your race or your gender. So when you have privilege if you mess up and it's just you messed up. You individually messed up. When you don't have privilege and you mess up, oh, well, that's like one more story of the, fill in the blank, racialized, gendered, whatever, right? Wherever the privilege is, wherever the privilege lies there. You can assume that if you work hard and follow the rules, you will get what you deserve. That And you could just assume that because you're entitled to it, right? When you feel that sense of, I've worked hard for this, I'm entitled to it, that's a privilege. Because there are people working just as hard as you who won't succeed. Not because of any personal failings on their part, but because of the systems and structures of inequality that grant unequal access. And that's where privilege sits. That you can succeed without other people being surprised and without being held to a higher standard. So in addition to your failings being just your own, you messed up. You got too drunk on Friday night and you fell down. You got too drunk on Friday night and fell down. You don't become you don't become labeled as the stereotype of an entire group based on your individual actions. That is a privilege. Same with your successes. That you go to university or you get a scholarship or you accomplish all the wonderful, beautiful things that you're going to accomplish. And it's not a big surprise to anybody. Good for you. I always knew you could do it. Not, oh my goodness, you've certainly overcome a lot. I'm surprised. That's sort of taken aback. Like, oh, you're going to law school? Wow. Those moments that happen in society, they speak to privilege. They also speak to racism and classism and all the rest of it. All the things that we can start to tune into when we start to tune into and pay attention to our own privileges. You can go out in public without fear of being harassed or constantly worried about physical safety. Now, this one is really important. We're talking about the baseline human right to be safe and free of harm in moving through the world. And if you don't really even think about it, right, you just can kind of go about your business most of the time, and you don't even think about your own personal safety, that is a privilege, because that is not the case for many, many people based on the color of their skin, their gender, their class, their ability, their sexuality. There's all kinds of things that make people vulnerable. And when you are vulnerable, when you feel vulnerable, that's when you know you don't have those privileges. It's when I know that I don't have male privilege, when I am nervous, when I feel nervous because of my gender, or when I am told women don't walk alone at night. Don't do that, right? And there's a really interesting conversation happening right now about changing the narrative about women feeling safe and safer, that the responsibility for women to feel safer is up to men because women are being attacked by someone. And so we keep trying to teach women how to be, go in buddies, carry your keys, look over your shoulder, all the safety techniques to keep women safe. We've been teaching women and girls this for decades. It's not working. There's still violence towards women and girls. So maybe we need to change our focus from the victim to the aggressor. And I just gendered binaried it. It's not just women and it's not just men, but it is vulnerability. So we need to start focusing on the aggressors and where is that aggression coming from and how do we stop that aggression? Because we are not all equally safe. And that speaks to social inequality and it speaks to privilege. That you do not have to think about your race or your gender or your sexual orientation or your disability on a daily basis. It is a privilege to not have to think about the color of my skin. I never have to think about it. It's a privilege to not have to think about the way my body works because I know the world has been built to accommodate my body. That is a privilege. It never has to occur to me. And that is not the case for many, many people. So we're thinking about social inequality being unequal access to power, wealth, privilege, and prestige that leads to hierarchical social organization. We call that social stratification, this hierarchical social, the hierarchical social organization of social inequality, whereby we don't all have access to power, to privilege, to wealth, and to prestige. We don't all have equal access. That's what marks social inequality. So we can think about social stratification referring to the relatively permanent, unequal distribution of goods and services in society. So stratification is these unequal systems and structures. There are those in which a permanent institutionalized hierarchy that accords some members privileged access to wealth, power, and prestige. So some people have privileged access and some people don't. And it happens in intersecting, cross-cutting ways. You can have some kind of privilege. You can have white privilege and not have male privilege. Or you can have white privilege and not have heterosexual privilege, or class privilege. You can have white skin and be very poor, and really come up against a lack of privilege and be labeled. When you're labeled and you're seen as different, right? Based on something that society has said makes you unequal. Sorry, I'm getting all worked up. And social status and social standing can be either ascribed or achieved, right? So I didn't achieve white privilege. I got born with this color skin. I didn't achieve it. And so ascribed, that's ascribed status. And it only means something. My white skin only means something in a cultural context that privileges whiteness. So it's me being born onto the winning team in its very specifically culturally constructed notion of who are the winners. So when we're trying to make sense of social inequality, we really need to pay attention to all of the sort of holistic factors that are creating conditions that favor some at the expense of others. And what is ascribed and what is achieved. So achieved status is based on a person's own efforts and achievements. An ascribed status is just based on birth. And so the value, the status that you are born into, that system is already in place. And so then you just sort of fit in to a privileged or unprivileged spot of an existing system. Achieving a status, a different, there's some kinds of status that is achieved. That is where there is, that's where, based on your own accomplishments or your own input, there can be an assignment and some movement. Now, social class is, in a capitalist system, often described as or talked about as an achieved status. So you can be born into any social class, but in a capitalist system, everybody could work hard and you can make your way. You can change your social class. The reality is most people don't. That doing so is incredibly difficult, especially to go up, because of all the other intersecting marginalizations that affect people, particularly people living in poverty. There's all kinds of systemic barriers that make upward mobility, class upward mobility, very difficult. But it's not impossible. And so maintaining the cultural myth of its possibility is what also then allows for the system to stay intact, because if you just didn't work hard enough, then it's your fault. Anybody can do anything in a capitalist system. So if you didn't, if you weren't able to overcome whatever social class you were born into, then that must be that you didn't work hard enough, or some other personal failing. You weren't smart enough, you weren't fast enough, you weren't pretty enough. Whatever gets assigned, to the blaming. So social classes are categories of categories of individuals. They're not fixed sites, but they're sort of categories of equal or nearly equal prestige, according to whatever the system is of evaluation. In a capitalist system, social class is often mostly marked by wealth, by material wealth, by capital. But there's other ways that class is assigned. So certain kinds of prestige that might come with your work. You might not get paid a whole lot, but it's got some prestige. So that sort of puts you in this sort of idea of a different social class. And these aren't fixed categories, and the boundaries aren't rigid between them. And there's the debate of whether or not class is achieved or ascribed. So the contemporary capitalist ideology would suggest that that if you work hard enough, anybody can achieve any socioeconomic class. That is premised on the idea that we are all starting on an equal playing field, that it is a level playing field from the beginning, which we know it isn't. And if it were a level playing field, then maybe that the differences in success would be based on individual achievements, efforts, or abilities, or achievements. The reality that we are not starting on an equal playing field suggests that socioeconomic class is some combination, in a capitalist system, some combination of achieved and ascribed. Which means that there needs to be a belief that some are born more equipped to succeed than others. Some are born to work harder than others. So if we're going to say that class is achieved, but not everybody will achieve the same sort of social class standing, then there needs to be an other explanatory narrative that says that some people are just more equipped. They're just more capable of success than others, however success gets defined. And then in order for that ideology to be believable, there must be some ability or quality that justifies why some people are upper class and some people are lower class, or some people are not. So what, if it's an achieved status, then what are the determinants that say some people can succeed and while other people can't? And that's what gets where we start cutting in other kinds of meaning around gender or sexuality or race or ethnicity. We can start overlaying justifying reasons. Well, that group of people is good at those kinds of things. That group is not. That's the racialization, right? Or the imposing narratives to make difference mean something and then organizing it in a hierarchical way. And it gets done all the time. And I really like this visual of the difference between equity and inequality. So inequality or equality would be that everybody is the same, right? Equality says I'm going to treat everybody the same, giving everyone the same thing. Whereas equity is about fairness. Equity recognizes that we are not all starting in the same place, but rather what we have to do is figure out how we can have equal access to opportunities, which means identifying the barriers. It means identifying what are the barriers to that equitable access. What is standing between equity and equality is those barriers, and that's the job. So if you hear talk of sort of the equity, diversity, and inclusion work, EDI is sort of how it's coined. It is about identifying. First thing it does is identify structural barriers. It identifies privilege. It identifies implicit bias built into systems and structures of unequal access. And it says, how do we create spaces where we are recognizing that we are not all starting from the same place and that there's all kinds of reasons for that. And then what do we do about that? And then so there's class and caste. Now the caste system is a kind of social class with a fixed or impermeable membership. So it is an ascribed social status. You are born into the caste. It is one way of organizing class, social classes and social structure, one sort of cultural way of organizing social status. So you are born into there's the caste. The most famous example of the caste system is the caste system in India, where you are born into the caste of your parents and of your ancestors, of your lineage, and there is no movement. That is, and with the caste system comes social rules. And it is a way of very clearly differentiating the work that needs to get done in society, who's going to do it. You marry inside, so that you marry inside your caste, you stay inside your caste, and it creates a very clear structure, a socially stratified structure, but a very clear structure. It is not equal access, certainly, but it is a very clear and predictable structure of social inequality. Whereas the capitalist version of social class, of socioeconomic class, presents itself as this porous system where it is unequal, but there's movement. There's the possibility of movement between it. Now, race. So that's how sort of we're powering through all the different ways that we organize ourselves unequally. And I want to talk about race. I've mentioned skin color and I've mentioned white privilege. So let's just think about race and ethnicity a little bit. So race we can think about as race is a culturally constructed category based on perceived physical differences, which implies hereditary differences between people and is used to justify social stratification. So race is a cultural construction. It is the story that gets told about the meaning of how somebody looks, the color of their skin, the shape of their nose, the texture of their hair, at one point there was measuring skulls to determine your race. There's been all kinds of scientific evaluations on the body to determine different races and different associations with that, what those perceived physical characteristics come to mean. That's where race exists, right? It's the stories we tell about what we think the meaning of how we look is. It is not descriptive. Race is not descriptive. It is hierarchical. Meaning, its meanings and values are always assigned and ascribed in a hierarchical way. The roots of the concept of race is in its differentiation, and in the differentiation, assigning more value to one over the other, that one is superior than the other. So identifying difference, making that difference mean something, and then saying that difference is inferior to the one doing the defining. It's an invention very specifically of the 18th century, and it emerges in stride with and in step with colonialism and colonial expansion throughout the world. It coincides with the Enlightenment period, where the Enlightenment period is where the intellectual movement in Western thinking to the scientific method to try and organize, categorize the world. So we've got sort of the Darwinian time of searching, out and about. We've got colonialism, European and empires out and about exploring the world, discovering new places, things, plants, animals, and this need to organize and categorize and create the lists of species and phylums and all the things we learn in high school science. All of that comes out of the Enlightenment period as a lens through which to come to see and understand the world. It's about reason and ration, so it's a move away from cosmological and spiritual explanations for things. This is the emergence of what we now know as what we now call Western scientific thinking, the scientific method, and organizing, categorizing, labeling, and understanding difference. Difference in plants, difference in animals, difference in the world. As European explorers are encountering new places and new people who look different. So just as they're organizing new species and understanding, right, these things called species and the plants and the animals and the birds, humans come into view in the same way. Well, they look different. Let's study that. Let's organize that. Let's create these categories called races. Now, anthropology, we're anthropologists in this class, anthropology was fundamental in the creation of the concept of race that then got deployed through the colonial project and got used to justify how even some races were maybe not even as human as others. There was different ranks of humans. And if they weren't as human, that absolutely then can be used as the justifying narrative for the assumption of superiority and racial superiority, which translates into overt genocide and slavery. Okay? Because there's full humans, and then there's these like sort of lesser than humans or subhumans, or maybe not subhumans. They're human, but they're lesser humans because of the color of their skin or because of the way they do things. This is also at the same time as anthropologists are creating these narratives of meaning making called race, of races, different races of people. They are also creating a hierarchical understanding of societies. So there's there's the primitive societies and then the civilized societies, and that triangle. And so those who are being encountered all over the world, the language, the colonial and colonizing language of the primitives are the savages, and then the civilized. The European empires are the civilized ones, and then their job becomes to bring civilization, to civilize the natives or the savages. All of this creates its own justifying narrative. This is colonialism's magic. It creates its own terms of engagement and then justifies itself in all of its genocidal violence and horror because it has created, and then it's called it science. It's scientific, therefore it's the truth. All of that is cultural narratives. All of that is cultural meaning making. Make sense of the world, organize it in particular ways, and exploit it. Because the flip side of colonialism, the other side of colonialism's coin is capitalism. So it is about looking for resources to be exploited, including human bodies and human labor. The concept of race gets created and deployed as a way of justifying that project. And it becomes embedded completely in the baseline ways in which humans have been talked about since. The same way we talked about the invention of the concept of homosexuality, where same-sex sex suddenly got a name and the individual engaged in that got the label. So you became a homosexual. Your sexual act became conflated with your identity. That is a cultural creation. It's the exact same thing with the concept of race at around the exact same historical time, where there is different looking people around the world and a colonial desire to exploit, to claim, conquer, and exploit those people and places. And so it becomes the justifying narrative inscribed onto bodies all over the world. And it has been enduring in the imagination, to the point where still I walk through the world with my white skin. I walk through the world that I live in with my white skin, and I am privileged for that because it has been completely normalized. The built-in assumptions of superiority, of assumed superiority, that is fundamental to the concept of race itself. So when I talk about race being a cultural construction, it's a way of classifying human beings based on observable and perceived physical characteristics. It is an arbitrary categorization of difference underscored by inequality, and is underscored by the assumption of superiority. The creation of the concept of race was not about explaining difference. It was about hierarchically justifying conquest, the conquest of some by others. And in order to justify that, you need to create a backup story. You need to create a backstory that says you're better. And that's where the concept of race comes from. There is no biological fact to the concept of race, that we are there's more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. What race is really it's the arbitrary narrative that gets assigned to the way people look. Saying that understanding race as a cultural construct should in no way diminish it as a lived social fact and reality. It is one of the most poignant moment of social interaction and encounter and vulnerability and violence. It is real. It is lived as real. What I am talking rather about is the process of cultural meaning making is the cultural construction. So however culturally constructed, the idea of race as a marker of difference and a tool for social stratification and discrimination is real. And it is activated, experienced, and felt. Now, one of the things, because we've sort of in this come through the concept of race has sort of embedded itself in our vocabularies to the point where oftentimes we're afraid of it. We don't want to, because racism is bad. We know racism is bad, but even though it's sort of like fundamentally built into the fiber of our society, we don't want to talk about it because it's bad. So that there's this concept of ethnicity, and oftentimes the two get sort of used interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. When we're talking about race and the racialization of some bodies, we have to call it what it is, right? It is about that art, the storytelling, making physical characteristics mean something, and then everything that happens in the name of that and gets deployed in the name of that. Then ethnicity is different. It is the perceived differences, such as culture, religion, language, national origin, by which groups of people distinguish themselves and are distinguished from others in the same social environment. So an ethnic group is a cultural group. Now, the group can self-identify, culturally self-identify for their cultural uniqueness, and ethnicity is used as discriminatory when the broader dominant group identifies that group as lesser than, somehow lesser than. Now, the conflation of the two, the interchangeability, the use of the interchangeability of the two can be the racialization of cultural difference, certainly, and it can also speak to the sort of gun-shy, the idea of being gun-shy around using the word race. What you mean is race, but you say ethnicity, but it's race. There's sort of overlap. And I'll put a link to it. It's gone. The actual original episode is gone from America's Next Top Model. It's quite old now, and I can't even believe it was. I can't believe it was actually done, but it was. So in this episode of America's Next Top Model, they the girls, the contestants their challenge was to the photo shoot challenge was to take on another ethnicity. We're going to change your ethnicity was the of the show. And but what they did, that was race. What they did was they painted in blackface. They completely changed the race. They racialized the models, and it was unbelievable what they did. So I would have loved to show you the actual episode itself. They've taken it off YouTube, but I will put a link to a photographer who sort of watches it in kind of horror and shock and be like, oh my God. But watch where they conflate race and ethnicity, because they're talking about how we're going to change your ethnicity and make you biracial, which isn't an ethnicity. That is or we're going to change your ethnicity, and I think one of them was to make you African American, which isn't an ethnicity, right? Ethnicity is about cultural beinghood. Race, it's the racialization of a body. So you'll see that sort of but yet where there's cultural distinctness is in whiteness. So Scandinavian was considered an ethnicity, as was Italian, I think. So those are ethnicities, and biracial as an ethnicity, you'll see. I'll put the link to it. And if you ever do find the whole episode of that America's Next Top Model, send it to me, because they finally took it off. They've probably got so much controversy because it's awful. And they actually ran it like on normal TV, and it was shocking. So, okay, that's my America's Next Top Model aside. So another the other one that did that was Survivor. The show Survivor did that. They called it ethnicity. They split the tribes by ethnicity, but it was totally race. And so there was the Latino ethnicity, but it was all Americans on the show, and then there were just people from different cultural origin, but it was super interesting as well. There was Asians, I know, and then I'll put the link to it. There's a great Mad TV spoof on that. That Survivor did that as well with the different. That's how they decided their tribes. Anyway, when we think critically about race and ethnicity, those pop culture moments are quite shocking. So another understanding of ethnicity is a shared sense of common cultural features. So the group is self-identifies for their cultural uniqueness. What that group, what the meaning that gets assigned to that can absolutely be a force and marker of social marginalization and social inequality if the dominant group deems them to be lesser than. But race and ethnicity are not the same thing. So I want to talk about the process of racialization. So race is the cultural construction, the meaning making, the storytelling about what the physical characteristics mean, organized in an unequal way. The process of racialization, this involves the construction of a specific image based on a set of assumptions or stereotypes accorded to a certain race. So again, the process of racialization is happening from outside the group as an act of power and domination to tell stories about what that particularly identified group is about, what they're good at, what they're not good at, this kind of stereotypes they can get wrapped around. That is a process of racialization. If the differentiation is based on how somebody looks, that is what associates them with the group, and then there's something said about the group. There's some assumption that gets built in and made about that group. That's racialization. It's the ways that the ideas about race get maintained and constructed, and the lens through which race-based thinking or race thinking operates. And we can see it most notably in the stereotype categories, stereotype assumptions that get associated with particular groups. They're good at basketball, they're bad at driving, they're drunk all the time, whatever. They're also, so the process of racialization is inherently racist. The concept of race is inherently racist because it assumes the superiority of the dominant group. And so when then there's conflations and assumptions that get made, that's called the racialization. And we really need to pay close attention to the kinds of stories that are told and conflated in that. And I would urge you especially to pay attention to, and it gets normalized, completely normalized, ubiquitously normalized into our collective common sense. And that's the implicit bias that sort of builds around us that allows these race-based systems to remain intact, because we don't always know. We might notice overt, blatant racism, but we don't notice the subtle ways that it is just built into collective common sense, it passed on in jokes, and however it moves, the racialization of characters and shows, who are the bad guys, who are the good guys, who are the and just the retelling of the same story, who are the victims, who are the retellings of the same kind of racializing stories. This is how these structures of meaning remain intact, and we need to pay really close attention to those. So the racialization, the race-inflected situations. So if you walk into a store and you are treated differently, you're treated in a specific way because of the color of your skin, you have been racialized, and that is a race-inflicted situation. Are you being followed around the store because somebody assumes you're going to steal? Are you being denied service because they assume something about you they don't know you, they've not talked to you, based entirely on how you look, is a race-inflected situation where racialization is occurring. The ways in which so we can think about racialization, the ways in which racial meaning structures understandings of situations. So basically, anytime race is noticed as race and it means something. When you will cross the street, when somebody's walking towards you and you make a decision and you cross the street, or you don't, or you smile and say hi. Those are race, and maybe the color of someone's skin informed that in a split second, maybe. And that is how we have to pay attention to race, racism, and racialization. So racism is the belief that characteristics and abilities can be attributed to people simply based on their race, and that some racial groups are superior than others. Race as a concept itself is racist. It is premised on the assumption of the superiority of some over others. That is the roots of the concept itself, right? Otherwise, we're just describing difference, and it doesn't mean anything other than we look different. Race has never been about just looking different. It has always been the narrative justification for the differential treatment of some, right, over others, the privileging of some, and the marginalization, exploitation, murder, genocide, selling of others, right? And so racism is the belief that it's the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that those racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Now, oftentimes the way that racism presents is that we don't register it that way. It's not a conscious thought that says, I am noticing the color of your skin, and I am informed by the assumption that I am superior to you. It doesn't really present necessarily in that kind of overt way. So there's all kind, but I might still cross the street, or I might still think twice, or I might not trust you 100%. And that is a racialized, so it's a racist, racialized, racially informed position based on the kind of ubiquitous ways that racism operates around us to structure how we perceive each other and how we can relate to each other. Whether you're and who we are in relation to these structures of social inequality, which is about unequal access to power, privilege, and prestige. So when you're in positions of privilege, you can sort of think about that. When you're not in a position of privilege, when you are always being judged, discriminated, assumed based on the color of your skin, you know you don't have white privilege. And you know it's racism. You know that you are being treated differently because of the color of your skin. When you're treated differently because of the color of your skin, it's racism, right? Like that is what it is. And so we have to really, if we are ever going to be able to move through racism, dismantle the violent structures. Just this week, we've got racialized, violent gun attacks in the United States that are gender-based and race-based. Right? If we are ever going to hope to move past any of this, we have to know what racism is when we see it, and we have to especially know it in ourselves, and we have to call it out. And so there's different kinds of racism. There's latent or passive racism. That's where you just sort of quietly notice something, or somebody tells a joke that is offside racist, and you maybe laugh, or you don't, like you laugh at the joke, right? You're like, oh yeah, because you get it, because you understand racism, because you understand the joke. You get the humor, then you're racist, right? And we're not. And racism it's not an accusation. It's just a reality. It's a reality in a racialized world that we have made race mean so much, and we operationalize it in so many profound ways. I believe we don't stop that until we really get out in front of it. So there's passive or latent racism, where it's just happening and you just let it happen. There's overt or manifest. There's overt manifest racism. That is the overt, statement, racist, blatant hate crime statements. There's individual racism. There's your own racialized and racist biases, whether it's implicit or explicit. So the implicit biases are just the ones you probably heard from your parents and their parents and all of your family, and you just sort of internalize those, and they just are there. So they just, before you even know why you've done it, you've crossed the street. Or before you even know why you've done it, you've paid extra attention to somebody who's just come in the store you're working in. And that's sort of a passive, latent individual articulation of racism. There's also cultural racism. There's also the collective kind of racialization and racism that is very much built into our systems. It's built into our school curriculums. It's built into our ways of being. It's built into our law enforcement. It's built into the walls of our cultural context that has differentiated people based on how they look, and then it operationalizes on a cultural level. Institutional and systemic racism. We see that built right into the structures of our society. In Canada, that is most overtly and specifically in relation to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous settler relations. Canada doesn't exist without colonial conquest. Colonial conquest is premised on the assumption of racial superiority. Settler colonialism doesn't happen without the dispossession and disappearing of Indigenous peoples, and we have institutionally built that into law. We have reserves, we have treaties, we have the Indian Act, we have all kinds of things that structurally maintain a hierarchy of unequal access based on race. So that is institutional and systemic racism. And then there's horizontal racism, and that can be racism exercised within a racialized group, the internalization of these imposed structures of racism that then operates horizontally within the group itself. And there's some interesting kinds of examples of that as well. So if racism is everywhere and ubiquitous, what do we do about it? And that's a really important question for us to all consider. And I would say we start by differentiating between being not racist and being anti-racist. So you can be not racist. You can say, I consciously want to confront racism. I would like to not be racist. I would like to not re-energize racializing ideas. I would like to not be racist. If someone tells a racist joke, you cannot laugh. You can recognize that it's racist and say, I'm not going to laugh at that. That's not funny. You can just say it to yourself, right? So that's not racist. You're not participating in that overt racism. However, you're not doing anything to stop it either. So anti-racism, I will say, anti-racism is where somebody tells a joke that is clearly racist, overtly racist, or even subtly racist, and you say, that wasn't funny. Not only was that not funny, that was overtly racist. And it's awkward, right? Being actively anti-racist in a deeply racist society like we live in is very awkward. It's awkward at family dinner. It's awkward at the pub. It's awkward. And it's really important because we don't stop racism unless we call it out. It's very uncomfortable. And maybe we have to be uncomfortable, especially those of us in positions of privilege. Maybe we have to get uncomfortable to disrupt and to upend these systems that privilege us. So we might not like it. We might not like the system. And yet when we're benefiting from it, we don't have a lot of stake in trying to change it because we're on the winning side. And it's about those of us on the winning side that need to take a look at the whole thing and say, okay, there's some parts of this that we have to burn down. And we have to burn them down because we are not all equally safe when we walk down the street, because our kids are not equally safe. And that's not acceptable, right? It is not acceptable that my son is likely much safer than some of your sons potentially in their encounters with a police officer because of the color of his skin, because he has my light skin. And so I'm going to leave it with you to start thinking about how do we confront racism? And then the last slide is just the ways we start to visualize or think about the ways that intersectionality, the intersections of marginalization, and we, sometimes the marginalizations accumulate, and lack of privilege accumulates. Sometimes we have it in some places and don't in others. So we can just start thinking about social inequality as a really complicated knot. It's messy and entangled, and it gets uncomfortable when we start pulling it apart. And I think we need to start pulling it apart. So let's pause and think about race. Let's think about racism. Let's think about how racism operates in your life, what you might be able to do about it, the difference between being not racist and anti-racist. And then to that end, I have, and I mentioned this, I think, a few weeks ago in seminar, but I last spring, my son's former football coach and his family He's from Chicago originally, and he left Chicago with his 2 young sons, and they've since had a 3rd son, because he didn't want his boys raised as young Black men in Chicago, in the world that he grew up in, because of the violence and the vulnerabilities. He didn't want them living in that world, and so they moved to Canada, and we're here. And so we met them through my son's football. But the majority of his family stayed in Chicago. And in the last few years, he has lost several family members to gun violence. And in June, or the end of May or June, he lost his brother and nephew to gun violence. And so in response to that event, and they were in Chicago, in response to that event, my son and his friends and I got together and offered a tribute to him, to Deontay, to their coach. Deontay is his name, and what we would do about it, what we would do to confront the unequal access that the boys that I was with experience as opposed to Deontay's sons. And so I've shared that little, it's short, but as an example of an anti-racist act is what we can do to say, how do we get good with getting uncomfortable and really meaningfully confronting these things. So I look so forward to hearing your thoughts on this, both in seminar and in your final assignments. We're going to talk some more. There'll be some questions to think about in how we move what we're learning in class out into the world in a meaningful way. So it's one thing to understand social inequality, and then it's another thing to try and do something about it. So I'll talk to you really soon. Take good care of yourselves and each other, and I look forward to hearing from you in seminar.